All right, good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate you taking time to come on over and have to bundle up to come to the other building. Today we're going to be working with text complexity. It was just a couple of weeks ago that Kathy Patterson and Holly Miller came over to visit one of our faculty meetings to really begin to introduce us to text complexity. Now, I'm not going to put anyone on the spot here, but let's think back to what they had to say about text complexity. What do you remember about text complexity, or what do you know, or what have you read about text complexity? We're going to kind of take our little notes here today, and then at the end we'll revisit and say, you know what, we've learned a little bit more, or we can validate what we already said we knew. So what do you remember, or what do you know about text complexity? Audrey?
The readability level might be easier to decode, as was used as an example, but the content, the information might be more appropriate for an older audience, or the way that the text is set up, or the amount of characters and storylines and viewpoints might be different in a more complex text as opposed to something that is easier to read or understand.
Okay, so Audrey's saying that when we look at the complexity of a text or how it is written or its structure, we need to take into consideration not just the words or the lexile in essence, but we really have to think about the content. What's the message of the author? Okay. Anything else we know about text complexity? Megan?
It's the length of the text.
Okay, the length of the text, we need to consider that.
I remember the grapes of wrath example.
Okay, the Grapes of Wrath example. What do you remember about that, Tom?
I remember that, because I love the book and the author too, but very easy to read, a complex theme and underlying current of sort of message that would be more complex than the readability would be.
Exactly.
Much easier.
All right, so Grapes of Wrath, the lexile is more like a second, third grade level. However, you probably wouldn't have that in your second or third grade classroom because of the content of it. All right, so it almost sounds like we're talking about content and theme as being equally as important as just the readability levels. Anything else? All right, I'll make it a little easier now. Think about how we currently select our texts. What do we do? Why don't you turn and talk with some of your table mates? What do we do when we're getting ready for guided reading or shared reading? How do we determine what texts we're going to use currently? Sounds like there's a lot of discussion. Why don't we try to capture some of that discussion up here on our chart? This table seemed to be very actively participating back here. Todd, maybe you can kind of share what your end of the table thought about when you go to select a book now. What do you look for?
Well, we discussed interests.
Okay, interests.
What would interest the children? And if it was something that was dry or wasn't going to catch your interest, we just wouldn't even consider it.
Right.
And then we considered the level.
And what do you mean by level? What are you looking at for levels?
Well, basically, with some of the texts I've used in the past, I know what's appropriate for where my students are. And I try to match something with what I think would best fit them, and use the DRP if I have the DRP level.
All right, good. So you're looking at DRP, you're looking at interest, the levels of the text. What about this table? This is kind of a younger grade group over here.
We choose very often by topic, so that it's content related. We try to, because we really need to pull in the other things that we're studying, so we try to bring in science and social.
Okay, so you're integrating science and social studies, so you're working off of topic. Good.
Off topic.
Okay.
We also, depending on the skill that we're working on, we may be doing predicting, inferencing, connecting, nonfiction versus fiction. So we also base it on that as well, and the understanding, comprehension, where kids are at. I also like to do it by interest. I mean, I literally take the kids across the hall with me, and we look at the books. And if something pops out at them, and it has always worked. It has always worked. And we also are starting, some of us have already started, and some of us will be starting literature circles. And they're really involved. The kids learn to be really independent. There's lots of different jobs. And once they all have practiced doing those particular jobs, and it really pulls a book apart And it really, really is a great indicator of understanding of a text. Normally we start out with simpler texts that are less complex because they are much more successful.
Mm-hmm. So you've kind of mentioned some of the same things. You go off of interest, you're looking for skills, and you actually talked about the complexity. You start much easier to help them gain the confidence, and then you make the text harder as you move along. How about the back table? Anything that you want to add?
Sometimes it depends on the purpose, if you're going to use it for shared reading or guided reading or whatever the group is, or some specific skill, even something if you're focusing on the sight words or you're focusing on a specific phonetic skill, will determine the type of text.
Great, so the purpose is ultimately important too. Wonderful, so you already know how to choose texts, and a lot of what you've mentioned today is going to continue, but we're going to add maybe another layer to it. Connie?
We were talking about the importance of the vocabulary itself.
Okay, paying attention to vocabulary and the development of it, all right. So today what we're going to be doing is to spend some time trying to understand what text complexity is as measured by the three-part model. And when I look at what you have responded today, I think we really do already look at many of the components that we're going to just build on a little bit more as we move forward dealing with the Common Core. Today our main focus is going to be on the qualitative piece of the triangle. Why we're dealing with this first is because, and you can see right here up on the screen, that one of the key requirements is that students must be able to comprehend, understand that text of steadily increasing complexity. Now, as a teacher myself, I would say, gee, how will I know a text is getting increasingly more complex? How do I measure that? How do I know, other than maybe looking at a Lexile number? But as Tom brought up that grapes of wrath, you can't always rely on that number. And DRA, how many of you can show me by way of hands, have ever said, oh, I'm going to get a level 30 out of the closet, and then you get it to your classroom and you realize, gee, this one is really hard. It seems much beyond what my children can handle. Or, boy, this is a 30. This is so easy. I didn't really get to the point where I really needed to even help the students to handle the text. How many times has that happened to you? So we're going to be building upon our knowledge, and yes, we will still use books that have a DRA level, but maybe we're going to look at them a little bit differently. Maybe we're going to level them in a different way ultimately. What you have in front of you today is a handout that is entitled The Standards, Grade Specifics, Text Complexity Demands. This is going to kind of serve as our visual today as we begin to further understand or better understand how we're going to be leveling books or talking about books when we are taking over and looking at the Common Core. So what we have is grade level bands. And you can see here, kindergarten and first grade is kind of off on their own, but then we have second and third grouped together, fourth and fifth, sixth through eighth, 9th and 10th together, and then 11th through CCR. CCR is standing for Career and College Ready. So if you think about the books that you read when you were in college, or maybe if you had another career where you had to read technical manuals and those kinds of things. So it really takes us to that extreme. Now, let's pretend that we're second grade teachers. Why don't you find the second grade strand today? It says, by the end of the year, read and comprehend literature, which it could be informational text, in the grades 2 and 3 text complexity band proficiently with scaffolding as needed at the end of the range. So if I'm a second grade teacher, I know that I can choose books, or I should be choosing books out of the band for second and third grade. But it doesn't say that I only teach or look for second grade books. I am expected to use a wide range of text all the way to the top ends of that band. And I'm going to be scaffolding their understanding or their reading of those books. So it's almost like we're stretching the students beyond, to some degree, what maybe their comfort level is. And so by the end of second grade, I could give a student a book at a higher level in that band, and with scaffolding, they would be able to read that. Now, if you look at the end of the grade band, which would be 3, it says by the end of the year, read and comprehend literature or informational text at the high end of grades 2-3 text complexity band independently and proficiently. So the expectation is, or the goal is, that by the end of 3rd grade, children could read at the high end of the 3rd grade band independently, really without scaffolding. It doesn't talk about scaffolding there, does it? So maybe we need to talk a minute about scaffolding. We may have different ideas of what scaffolding is. So any ideas that you'd like to share? What do you think scaffolding really means? I know no one wants to go on tape. I understand that. Todd?
Scaffolding just means building on top of something to increase whatever level they're on.
Okay, building on top of something. What else? Vicki, did you want to jump in?
I think of things like visual supports for kids, graphic organizers, things that you would do with students. These are not texts maybe that kids are going to go out at their tables and read, but you'll be watching and intervening. Those are some of the ways that I might scaffold.
Okay, so offering supports for students. You couldn't just hand them the book and say, here, read it independently. However, you're going to maybe pre-teach some vocabulary. You're going to have them stop after a couple pages, maybe have a conversation. Connie?
Similar to that, I was just going to say breaking things down step by step, like we'll scaffold a summary, we work on who, what, where, break it down.
Great. So breaking things down. Santo?
I think of it as like a construction. You know, you have the first level of scaffolding and you build to that part, and then you have to put another layer of scaffolding on until you can build again to get to the next part to continue to build on what's previously done, I guess.
And actually, I'm glad you brought up that analogy, because you're going to see with the Common Core State Standards, the stair step. It's like you're taking the students to the next step up. So that's really important to think of that as scaffolding. So these are the grade bands. So for example, if you're a 6th grade teacher, you're really looking at 3 bands. You can choose books from grades 6th, 7th, and 8th that will stretch your students. So by the end of 6th grade, they really need to be reading independently at some of those higher levels. So this is kind of a switch for us. We're very used to hitting the target of, okay, at the end of 2nd grade, they're going to be reading at a DRA 28, or at the end of 3rd grade, they're going to be, we've had specific targets. Here's a little bit different because we have more of a variation. All right? So that's how this is a little bit different. Now, switch this. One example, and I hope that you will get a chance to go online. Pam and I tomorrow, we will put maybe the link to the Common Core State Standards. We've actually printed it out in color, but there is something called the Appendix A that will be something that you can look for to kind of get a better understanding of this. But we pulled out one of the anchor standards today. And this happens to be Anchor Standard 10. And it is at every single grade level. So complexity is where we wanted to start, because every single grade level has to deal with this particular concept. So the anchor standard in every single grade is read and comprehend complex literary and informational text independently and proficiently. So here at the 6th grade, you're going to see, as I mentioned, grades 6 through 8 text with that scaffolding. But by the end, you wouldn't need to scaffold. You'd expect that students would do things independently. Now, Pam is going to talk, I believe, next about the Lexile levels, because, we're teachers. We like numbers. We like something to hang our hats on. So we've really hung our hats on DRA, but we're going to be talking about Lexile and how we can move it forward. So here's Pam.
Okay, this is the revised Lexile bands for the grade levels, the bands that Ann just referred to. Do you have a copy of that in front of you?
Yes.
Great, okay. So the first thing you can notice is the previous Lexile levels to the left, and then the new Common Core Lexile levels to the right. And what's the first thing that stands out to you looking at those numbers? Yeah, quite an increase. You'll notice not quite as significant, pretty minor in grades 2 through 3 in comparison, but certainly grades 4, 5, 6 through 8, and so on and so on. There's a significant increase, upwards of 100 points. This is all building, and as Ann said, using that staircase model to get to college career reading ready. And the impetus to that is they found in, I think it was 2008, 2009, that the ACT test that students take, which is similar to SATs some students take, only 50% of kids were proficient who took that exam in reading. So that was a big wake-up call. So in order to get to the higher levels down here, we need to start building in the lower grade levels. The other thing I want to point out is the K1, the Lexile, this is all based on computer software programs. It's kind of all, thrown in, and they measure things like word, the length of words, sentence structure, the length of sentence, word frequency, all those good things I'll talk about in a little more detail in a minute. And they found that method really doesn't apply to grades K and 1. So they use teacher experts to define exemplar text in those grade levels, and that's why you see no numbers there. The other thing is, as you mentioned earlier with the Grapes of Wrath example, that sometimes these numbers can be counterintuitive. In other words, sometimes the Lexile level will indicate that it falls within a band, and then we look at it more qualitatively and realize that it certainly doesn't. It's just, it's a more complex text. Okay, so our guiding questions. What is text complexity? Well, we spoke of that in the beginning, and we identified things like what I just mentioned. Sometimes it's a lower reading level or readability level, but more complex meaning. What are some other things you mentioned? The length of text, and then use the Grapes of Wrath example. Okay, so those are all certainly true. There's a few more sort of add-ons that we'll talk about as we move along. And how do we measure text complexity? Well, as you can imagine, it's complex, so let's talk about that in a little more detail. The standards are defining text complexity as a three-part assessment of text difficulty that pairs qualitative and quantitative measures with reader task considerations. And that is a triangle model, a three-part model, and you'll notice that all parts are equal, and they're equally important, and that without all three parts, it's an imperfect model. So the Lexile consideration is the quantitative, that's measurable, and as I mentioned, that's sort of all done by computer. The qualitative, that takes our professional judgment. So, I'm going to explain a little bit. There's certain considerations that we factor in and use our professional judgment to help sometimes correct the measurement from the quantitative. And then the reader and task, that's who and what. So who's reading it? And we consider some of those things that you mentioned earlier, like interest and motivation. And then what are we asking them to do? I mean, there are times that you're reading a text for a different purpose where, you might be able to really stretch and be at a much higher level. Certainly if you're working with a partner and you're just looking for answers to questions. I mean, there are times that you really need to factor that in. Okay, so the three-part model, I'm going to break it down by part. Quantitative, we all know what that is. It's numbers, measurement, things that, we can quantify. And we look at the readability level. It's measured by, as I said, software. There's an algorithm. There's different programs that you can purchase. The Lexile model is based on, what's it called, Metametrics Inc., something like that. But what it does is, as I said earlier, it looks at the word length, the sentence, so it's syntactic analysis as well as semantics. It looks at the frequency of words. It looks at the familiarity of words. And it puts all that in some sort of computer brain. I don't know how it all works, and it comes out with a number. So that is, that's the Lexile numbers, and that's certainly an important consideration, but not in and of itself. My favorite, and the one we're going to spend most of today talking about and practicing, is the qualitative piece of that triangle. And as I said earlier, sometimes this is corrective to that quantitative piece, like in The Grapes of Wrath. Certainly not a second grade level novel. We know that. So we use our professional judgment. The qualitative takes a human reader. We've got to actually read text and consider it in detail. And there are 4 levels of things that we need to consider, starting with the levels of meaning. Is it sort of very little, right there, one level, or does it have multiple levels? Is there hidden meaning? Is it a satire? Can the students get the gist right away, or do they need to infer? So that's what levels of meaning refers to. Structure deals mostly with organization. So is it a familiar organization that the students are used to? Have they learned the expository essay and what to read and how to decipher that type of reading? Or is it something unusual that they're not familiar with? When I was thinking about this, I thought of a dissertation. If you know how to read a dissertation, you know that Chapter 2 is your literature review, Chapter 3 is methods, and then the analysis part, the actual studies, in Chapter 4. Well, if you didn't know that going in, you would be confused reading it. So there's certain knowledge that you need to consider when you think about the structure of text. Language is another important consideration. A good example, a very obvious one, is Shakespeare. Now, we wouldn't use authentic original Shakespeare in elementary school because of a number of reasons. Not necessarily, well, a number of reasons. But one of them is the antiquated language, right? When you think of Grapes of Wrath, there's a lot of language in there that students would need to have an understanding of. You'd need to understand also concepts like economics and poverty and things that are much more sophisticated. Language, you can think of the student in terms of what their background is. And then knowledge demands. You know what the demands are, you know your students. So, what are their cognitive abilities? What sort of background do they have? How is their vocab? All these things come into play. And you kind of put all those factors together. Some will apply and some won't. And so you need to consider all those things as you're deciding where to place a text and how complex it is, and is it appropriate for your students. And the last part of the 3-part model is the reader and task. Again, that's who's reading it and what are we asking them to do. And you all mentioned earlier that you use all the appropriate things that we think of, like interest. Motivation is a big one. I used to tell my students that if I was stuck on the side of the road and motivated because I had a flat tire, all of a sudden my car manual would be of great interest to me. But normally it would not be enjoyable reading for me, and I would not have any interest in it at all. When we think of motivation in terms of text for students, it's often an assessment or an assignment. So that can be, very compelling for students. What's in it for me? Purpose of tasks. Sometimes, like I said earlier, you might just be skimming text, right? Certainly depending on what we're asking of students in terms of an assignment. Are they studying? Are they using the text for study? Or are they reading it for enjoyment? Is it a test? Is it something that they're reading together? Are they using it in a literature circle? So they want to come up with what's their role? What part did I really visualize? These sorts of things. And then the complexity of that task and the questions that we're asking them. So all those things factor in that 3-part model. And each, as you can understand, are equally important, very different. It doesn't work if you remove one of those parts of the triangle. Okay, and Vicki is going to talk to us about the rubrics.
So before I start, tomorrow Anne will attach the PowerPoint to your daily notes so you have that. And also she referenced Appendix A, which we can send the link for. It's a lot of the information is also in Appendix A, and it is very clearly laid out, and there's other information in other parts of text that you might want to look at. So as we have the overview now of the three-part triangle, one of the things that we're really going to be focusing on today is that qualitative piece. The qualitative piece of how does a teacher really look at a text and know that a child can read this independently or with scaffolding, and how we will do that. So the rubrics that we're going to be looking at today allow us to evaluate the elements of the text that are missed by the computer. The computer does not know that Grapes of Wrath has a content that is significantly higher than our lower kids could understand. So it's really done mostly and best done by a human. So we're going to be looking at the rubrics. There's a literary and an informational rubric that we will be looking at. So both rubrics, and literary and information, are going to look at the layout of the text. They're going to look at the structure, the purpose and the meaning, the language features, and knowledge demands. Most of you have hit on some of those pieces when we were talking originally and initially about text complexity. The rubric is going to rate all the way from simple to very complex text, and it will be able to help us. And both rubrics classify, these are the examples, simple, somewhat complex, complex, and very complex. So as we start to look at the rubrics, it's really important for you to understand that it does not go by grade levels. That you cannot look at a simple text and assume that it's a lower grade level. There will be high Lexile numbered texts that will still maybe fall in some areas into the simpler categories. So as we look at those, they'll be very helpful for us. And also important to know that because the factors for obviously for literary texts are different from informational texts, the two rubrics have different content. So we're going to look at some texts today, similar to what we did with the Grapes of Wrath, and look a little bit more at the rubrics. So if you could just take a couple of minutes in your packet below the first page where Anne showed us about the bands, there's the two rubrics that we have available to us right now that will assist us. The first is literary text, and the second is informational. So if you can just take a couple of minutes and look at that and talk in your groups and see some of the things that you notice. It's similar to a DRA analytical rubric where there's categories and you can go all the way across the bands. So there's two rubrics that I'd like you to take a few minutes and look through. Talk in your groups, and then we'll talk about what you have observed. So what are some of the things that you noticed as you looked at the two different rubrics for the complexity of text in that qualitative component?
We're going to have Joanna share. We're going to mic Joanna. Oh, yes, we are.
Okay, we were talking about, I think I noticed too, as we all did, that if you look from the simple text to the very complex text, the foundation is there and it carries all the way through. But we noticed that it is really broken down into smaller components so that there is more of an introduction, I think, as we go from simple text through to very complex text. But we were also talking about something when we're doing our assessing, the DRAs that we do at the end of second grade, that level 28, it's nonfiction and it's really a very simple text. So we feel that that's, even though that's supposed to be, quote unquote, the highest level that well, not the highest that we can test at, but that's what we're aiming, that's our benchmark for the end of second grade, that it's really, in fact, a very simple text. And I can almost give, but hopefully by the time the end of the school year comes, even my kids that I would be a little bit leery of, not because of the complexity or the understanding, but because it's a very simple, books to read, but I want to know they're really not showing me what I need to know about those children.
So if
they're not complex enough.
So if we're thinking of that 2 to 3 band,
right
now our end of the second grade benchmark is really much more in the simple text. If we put the three parts together, the word length, the sentence length might be there, but the concepts are really still very simple.
Yes.
And then we're going to be expecting by the end of third that we move to a much, much more complex text. I think that you will find as you look and start to look at some Lexile levels that they don't really compare to what our existing DRA levels are. You'll see a difference even in that. There are charts that compare, but there are pretty wide bands for that. So you'll start to see that.
Any other brave souls?
I just want to quickly support that, just 2 seconds, that it is at a 24, that middle of second grade, we're measuring fiction with an oral retell, and then we go to level 28, nonfiction, written retell, simple idea, and the next time they do it, it's a level 30, fiction, written retelling of summary, interpretation, more complex ideas. So it kind of goes from 24 to 30 without that sort of scaffolding with assessment in between. So just a kind of an observation about the present where this could support that.
And I think that's really important to point out. Again, it goes back to that scaffolding, that when we look at the text, when I was at one of the other tables, we talked about that these rubrics, if we look at this, will also help our instruction. That if we're picking a book that we know is more complex, we can look at these bands and break it up and then know certain areas that we may want to scaffold for that text. If a text is going back and forth between characters, we may need to have that graphic organizer that helps kids through that. And that's how we'll stretch them to grow into higher levels of text. So as we look at the rubrics, we have different books that we're going to be looking at and looking at that qualitative piece of the 3-part model. So the first book that we're going to be looking at is Holes by Louis C.H.R. And some of you, I think, use that at Juliet Long. Some people will be familiar with that text. If we look at the text, Fry is a different readability level, and that has it at 4.9. I looked at the Lexile, which is a 660. If you look at your Lexile bands, a 660 is in the 2nd to 3rd grade range. That 2nd to 3rd grade range in its readability in that computer model of the mean length of sentence, the number of multisyllabic words. It's just the computer numbers. So you can see in this particular book, for example, it really is not a 2nd and 3rd grade book in the same way that we mentioned The Grapes of Wrath. If we look at Holes, the story jumps back and forth between 3 different periods of settings, and it has a lot of jumping with characters and books. So when we looked at this as a district, we now look and you can see the quantitative measurement, and then we add the qualitative, and the adjusted text complexity moves it to a 6 to 7.5 grade level, which is then we can see where it would be a stretch text, where it's really stretching kids to be able to handle many more things inside literature than just looking at the numbers. So that to me kind of clarified where you cannot look just at the Lexile level because, and I think that goes back to the same thing that we were talking about with the 2nd and 3rd grade texts, that we're not going to be solely based on that, and as we look at the rubric, it's going to really help us to clarify what can kids handle. So we have Holes as a possible stretch text. I like the use of that word stretch text because it really takes them from where they're independent now to how we're going to scaffold and move them to where they need to be. And it's challenging students' reading capacity to help them grow. The scaffolding will be needed. I don't know that we talked much about background knowledge and really that teacher-directed level of the text. I think as we move on, we're going to have more conversations about what that scaffolding will look like in your classrooms. The Sun Also Rises is another example by Ernest Hemingway. The Fry readability level, which I think sometimes comes up on our computers and will show that way, is a 5.8. Very different than the Lexile number, which is a 610, lower than Holes. And as we look at the levels of meaning, there's images, word choice, emotions. Words are sparse. There's multiple themes in the book. Clearly much higher than the 2nd to 3rd grade reading level that it's listed at under Lexile. And then the adjusted text complexity, when we look at all of the themes that kids are expected to understand, would move it all the way to an 11.5. We have another example of Crispin. I know some of you have that, I think, in our book bins. The Fry is a 5.0. Here the Lexile is very different. It's a 780. I think if you look, that's in the 4th to 5th grade band. And then the language patterns and dialect in the language piece on that rubric really do change what Crispin might be able to be used at, and the adjusted complexity level would be 7th grade. I think those are good examples to show us that this 3-part triangle is really hopefully going to improve our ability to increase kids' progress in reading. The last sample that we have is a Raisin in the Sun. There's no Lexile level for this. When I looked it up, it did share that there's not a lot of prose, enough prose in the book to give it a Lexile. So the Fry was a 6.8, but the knowledge demands, there's racial tension, there's debate. They have to have a really in-depth understanding of the race and real estate issues. So changing it from a 6.8 grade level, Fry level to the adjusted complexity of moving to a 9th to 11th grade band. So depending on the text, we will change that as needed. And then Anne is going to come on up and move forward with the next part where we're going to look at some samples and the rubrics at the same time.
Well, we have heard about the 3 different parts, but if you're like me, you're asking, how am I going to do this for every single text, every single day, in order to make the best choices? So we're going to practice today with this text. As I mentioned, it is a small section from the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. What we're going to do is this. We're going to spend about 15 minutes. What we're going to have you do is read through the text, and then you're going to take your rubric and you're going to, by yourself, think about, well, what about the layout? And maybe just underline or mark where you think it falls in the rubric. So this is kind of your time to try to begin to process what you've read about and what you've heard and apply it to this. And then we'll come back together as a table and then as a group to share where we think this falls. So why don't you take a few minutes now to read silently. Your hand, if this was kind of meatier than you're used to reading. I could see the second grade team. Everyone has their hands raised. So wait until you see what level this is going to be. So let's talk a minute about which rubric did you decide to use? Did you decide to use the literary rubric, or did you decide to use the informational rubric, and why? We are very divided, so it'll be interesting to see kind of which way you went and why. Can you mic Deb Mahalko? She had a really good couple of things to say.
Where is she?
Deb, tell us which one you used and why.
We chose to use the literary rubric because we noticed halfway down that the structure was a narrative structure and that it didn't have the text nonfiction, or the nonfiction text features, as we call them now. It was not the structure of an informational text. It was more the structure of a literary text.
Okay. Anyone else choose the literary version? This tape, okay. Mary Gail, we'll mic you. Why did you choose this one?
Oh, I just thought because of the style in which it's written.
So you thought the style?
The style is definitely literary. It's not written in an informational style. That's just what I thought.
And it was labeled in narrative too, so you would hope that that would be the style. Good.
No, it just is too complex to be informational.
Somebody that thought it was informational and decided to use that rubric. Audrey.
Well, I went to informational and then I went back
Okay,
to
talk to
literary.
us.
Because we know that Frederick Douglass was a historical figure and we're learning about him, but at the same time it's written by him and it's more of a memoir. And when I think of a memoir or things about their life that they're discussing, it falls in, the literature, not necessarily the nonfiction. And just like Deb Mahalko said, it doesn't have those nonfiction text features that I look for when I'm reading nonfiction. So, and then he had a lot of figurative language and images and some symbolism that I wouldn't find in a nonfiction text. I'd be more prone to find them in a fiction piece. Well, not fiction. This is more based on actual events. However, I don't know. Back to it.
one of the things in my mind when I was looking at this is really making a slight shift for me from away from fiction and nonfiction to the idea that it's literary versus the informational text of giving information. That clarified it a little bit more for me. That Frederick Douglass as a writer is a literary writer. He's got there's figurative language in here. There's other pieces in here, and that it is more of a hybrid because it does have obviously some truth to it, but that it is literary versus in the rubric does not say fiction and nonfiction.
Can you take it back to author's purpose?
Well, yeah, I mean, my first thought was to go with informational because I think of it as a great primary source. I would use it in a social studies class, so that's where I was thinking. And it would certainly add to, if you were teaching about, Reconstruction and all that. So
But
I think that's
the author's
important.
purpose in this article was not so much informational as it was kind of entertaining and showing his point of view, but not providing information in the same way.
Or I was thinking purpose of how you're going to use it, too.
Oh, okay.
I think both
Well, I
are
was thinking
important.
of author's purpose.
Yes. Because we remember the reader task purpose is also important.
He had quite a dilemma because his one of the components of freedom is having knowledge, and his knowledge does him in. He says, "Screw it! I have to think now, and that's all I'm going to think about is reading." So a little that thing came to mind about that thing about a little knowledge is dangerous. And this man obviously had enormous amount of knowledge, and the structure of the language is really poetic. There, freedom now appeared to disappear, no more forever. Whew. Wow, that's serious stuff right
This
there.
probably isn't second grade level there, Tom. No. Connie over here has a comment.
I think it's probably okay to use both rubrics to determine the complexity of a text, especially at this level. And I think that as, we're so elementary, we think we have to have nonfiction text features. But we don't, as nonfiction becomes more complicated, I don't think we need to have those text features. I think this is teaching us that too. So I would use both.
And remember, Common Core is asking us to use more primary, secondary sources, so that's an important point.
Right, I think this is a dilemma that we're going to struggle with as we begin to look at something not just as fiction or nonfiction, but as more of a complex text, a literary, piece of writing. So let's take a peek and see where this falls. The state does have, this is one of their anchor sets, so we're going to see how close we came. The state decided to use the literary version. So when we looked at the layout, when you think about the layout, when you look at what you kind of decided, was it more simple? Was it somewhat complex? When we looked at all of the different options, there are no graphics, but there's a lot of text. So it's probably not simple, but yet it's not very complex. So it's somewhat complex. And again, because this is the first time we're using this rubric, we need to learn to calibrate ourselves. The state is saying to us, when you have a text similar to this, this is somewhat complex. So kind of begin to get this in your mind as, okay, it doesn't have any pictures, it's just straight text. It's somewhat complex in the layout. When we look at the purpose and meaning, the state again says it is somewhat complex. He's really trying to convince the readers of really the evils of slavery, but he goes a little bit deeper. I heard Mary Gale reading kind of what he was saying at the end, how he wishes he had never learned to read because now he understands how pathetic, in essence, his life is in comparison to those who have more freedom. And Tom alluded to that as well. So, again, the state is saying this is somewhat complex. It has a purpose. It tends to be related throughout the text. It doesn't really, when you go over to the complex text, it doesn't really lead to implicitly explaining something, and it's not difficult to find. It doesn't, you don't have to separate it all out. It's really quite basic. It's right there. So it's somewhat complex. Then we look at the structure. It's organized. It's in order. Pretty easy to follow. This is considered simple.
Excuse me.
Yes?
What's the difference between a layout and a structure?
When you look at your rubric, you will see that the layout is more about the placement of text, whereas the structure is the organization of how the author's getting his ideas or her ideas out on the paper. Okay? So I think layout is probably more the physical piece of it, whereas it's more, the structure is the content, how it's shared. So this is rather simple in nature. Now the language. It certainly wasn't simple. Some of you are reading it and saying, wow, I haven't read something like this since I was in high school or college. So the language was somewhat complex. For some of us it might seem very complex because we teach a younger grade, but keeping it all in line, it really is somewhat complex. It's clear. There's some figurative language. The part about the bread. He's saying, I could have the bread to hand to my friends to help them teach me to read, but he's also talking about the bread of knowledge at the same time. So there's some figurative language in there. So that tips it, I'd say, to somewhat complex. And then the knowledge demands. Renee, I can tell we need to mic you. Okay, talk to me about that. We should...
I think unless...
Hold on, Renee. Hang on, we're going to mic you. It's good to have these kinds of discussions.
Unless I'm understanding what they mean by language, I think that the sentence structure is very difficult. I used also to carry, among much of other interesting matter. I mean, and there are a lot of other examples in here that are not your basic sentence structure. I mean, it takes pause to read and comprehend what it's saying before you need to go back. I don't think that is somewhat complex.
But prudence forbids.
Mm-hmm. And I don't disagree with you. When I did this, I put it under complex text. Does that mean that we're wrong? No. That means that that was our lens to that. But we also need to know that just like when we do the anchor sets for writing, maybe we need to recalibrate our thinking now and say, you know what? At this band level, we're going to figure out what that band level is shortly, this is really considered somewhat complex.
As I've been doing a little bit more work with the standards, that is one thing that I am really finding that I have to shift. I am shifting to what I think is a higher level text is now really a lower level text. And I think we'll see that along the way as we look at other exemplars in the appendixes and other pieces that the national standards have already looked at. That we are going to see that what we think is challenging at our grade level may in fact be slightly less challenging in the new standards than we previously thought.
And those specific instances that you mentioned it's not meaning. So you understand the meaning of that language. It's more the structure of the way you put those words in the sentence that was different than with the way we speak.
But there's some language, they gave tons. Who knows? Kids aren't going to like that. They gave two interesting thoughts.
I would be curious as to whether a middle school teacher or high school teacher
well, what level kids
would
wouldn't understand that?
Right, and you know what? I think that you put groups of people in rooms and gave them this, I think we'd all come up to a little bit maybe of a different idea. However, just like when we do the anchor sets in writing, someone might give a paper of 4, someone might give a paper of 5. You're off by 1. And remember, the bands are very wide. Ultimately, we're going to come up with a band, and we're going to say this could be 4th or 5th grade, or this could be 6th through 8th grade. So there's quite a range. I think right now we're still stuck in, I'm teaching 4th grade, and is this appropriate? You know what I'm saying? So we have to begin to break out of that mold and say, you know what, this is appropriate across a very large band. So it is going to take us some time, and it's going to take practice and getting us calibrated. Again, I had some different ideas in here too, but it makes me begin to look more closely and ask more questions. And that's really at the stage we are. We don't have the definite answers. This is going to take a lot of time, and we're going to be doing this with a lot of different books. Later on, Bonnie has been kind enough to pull some of the anchor texts and we have them labeled, and I'm going to give you a chance towards the end of today to look at some of the texts that are in the bands that you're going to be teaching or expected to teach. So that might be as helpful. This one might just be a little bit out of the realm of what levels we teach here in the school, but I think when you look at some of the other books, that might be a little bit more helpful.
And when we look at this too, don't forget that we're going to look at a text in all three parts of the triangle.
Yes.
So when we look at the lexile and we look at the reader and the task, purpose, that will also shift this as well.
Right.
None of the pieces of the triangle are used in isolation. So in some of these disagreements, when you see the lexile numbers for this, it may make a little more sense. And when we look at curriculum and where things are taught and kids' background knowledge and the purpose of using something, and as we put the three of them together, it'll make it a little bit easier for us to choose, I think, correctly.
So really, we've just looked at the qualitative. And so the state is saying on their anchor rubric here that it's somewhat complex. We might think it's maybe a little bit more than that, but we're going to go with what the state says. So that's just one part of the triangle. Let's look at the other parts of the triangle. If you were going to teach this, you have to think about kind of that reader, task, consideration. What do you want the students to get out of this? I mean, why would you pick this? Are you practicing inferencing skills? Are you working on visualization, on questioning skills? You know, what is the purpose? What do you want the students to get out of this? So that's going to play a part too. And that's kind of hypothetical today because we're not really going to probably use this with most of our students, but it gives us a thought process that we'd work through. Do they have enough background knowledge? So interestingly enough, when we pulled the lexile on this, we have this particular band. So looking at your rubric, what band, grade band, does this put this book in?
6th grade.
6th to 8th grade, right?
4 through 8.
6 through 8 is 990.
Right, so 770 and 980 falls in between that.
So it actually is
fourth
even
to sixth,
more broad.
Yeah.
So it goes from what? 4th to 8th grade.
And if you have an 8th grader that's reading this, they may not need the direct instruction and the scaffolding. But if we keep going back to that as well, that if you're teaching it in a content area when you're looking at a unit on the Civil War, a student would really need a lot of support. We'd have to be putting those vocabulary words up. We'd have to be doing a lot more instruction than letting kids do this on their own.
Right, and that gets back to scaffolding. So when we put all three of the pieces together, we have the somewhat complex piece, we have the lexile range, which really has a very broad band, and then we would consider what is it that we want our students to get out of it. And Vicki came up with a couple of different ideas. And when you kind of put those all together, the state has said, and I think we'd pretty much agree, this is probably in the grade band 6 through 8, towards the higher ends. This might be a stretch text. Connie, where would you put it?
I would put it 9 to 10.
9 to 10?
Yeah.
And so,
For me, the language, the vocabulary, the sentence structure, the old-fashioned, somewhat slave language integrated in it is very complex.
and I think it's going to be important.
The text is also very complex.
And I think it's going to be important for me to give you the anchor for the grade level you're suggesting, because you're going to see that you would probably say, oh goodness, this is college level. It really is changing.
I find it interesting when we score our prompts, and we score harder than the state scores. And yet, this is flip-flopping. Yeah.
I think we're going to be surprised at what we're going to be scoring and writing somewhere down the line. I really think the rigor is ramping up here.
And don't forget, these are national standards too. So Connecticut standards have been one thing, and this is a national piece as well.
Connecticut standards have been high, haven't they?
Yes and no.
To the rest of the country?
But
yes and no.
Not in comparison to the rest of the world necessarily, and that's what we're finding, and to want our students to compete nationally, which is why we're moving everything up.
Also, isn't there a sorting in the rest of the world that we're not considering? that they take a test that sorts them into whether they're going into industry or academics?
In many countries, that is indeed true. It is not true in ours. We will instruct any student that comes through our doors.
Right.
But we're still going to be instructing to the same standard regardless of where they come in.
I'm not saying that we shouldn't.
No.
I'm just saying that when you're doing a comparison, the comparison should be fair.
But if I can go back to
makes
that
us look
point
bad,
from
and
the
I don't think
beginning
it is.
with the ACTs and how only 50% of our students were proficient in reading that took that test, what they found is they weren't lacking in what we're teaching in terms of comprehension strategies. They were able to make connections. They were able to determine importance. Where they fell short or they fell down was in the complex text examples. They couldn't answer simple multiple choice questions. And that's what skewed them and made them a lower level. Because I think we've given so much consideration on teaching kids to read that sometimes we're not. I would use this in a 6th grade class. I would scaffold it, I would teach it, I would, prepare them for it. But I think that's what we've got to start thinking about. How much are we pushing them to be prepared to read independently in college without the scaffolding, or go to work and read a manual.
And if we look at the first bullet on the end slide now, it really does talk about that we're really just orienting ourselves to this. This is a long process, that we are not going to be correct at the beginning. We are going to have a lot of conversations about it and really try and reframe our minds along the way. That this is really an initial understanding for all of us. And that as we keep going, hopefully we'll develop a more of a complex understanding of it. And as we look at multiple texts, then we'll start to see some differences. And maybe we'll still disagree on some of them. But I do think that as we look at multiple texts, it will increase our understanding.
Right, and I think this begs the fact that we're going to need a lot more practice. We're going to definitely need more professional development. I really am looking forward to bringing text to grade level meetings and working through some of the texts that we currently have, and because we're so familiar with them, and seeing how close we can come based on the anchor sets for more of the books at the grade levels we're accustomed to teaching, and again, we have some of those today. And also just finding more tools that we need, more resources, as the state or other states that are embracing these content standards are going to be putting things online. We can begin to pick the brains of other people that are doing the very same work as us. This is not just us reinventing the wheel. This is us all working together at the same time. And again, we may vary a little bit, but again, the bands are wide enough. So you give the wrong DRA book. You know what? You realize, tomorrow I'm not going to go and revisit that book. I made a bad book choice. Haven't we all had that moment? I know I have. So you know what? I thought that this was going to be the perfect book for my reading group today. It really didn't fly. Put it away. Get something more appropriate. We can't be so stuck on leveling a book and labeling it in a band. It's really about, is it appropriate for the kid? Is it moving the children forward? Those kinds of things. So yes, we need to know the scientific piece to it, but yet there still is that judgment. So let's not get hung up on, I don't like this band, or, those are great discussions, but ultimately we don't have to worry about all of that quite yet. So moving forward, we're certainly going to do a lot more of this work in the school setting. And right now, like I said, we can start with what we have and have some of these discussions. One of the things that is a recommendation for now, as we're kind of moving from the CMTs into, some of the different testing that's coming down the pike in a couple of years, is to really look at what we're using in our classrooms now. Sure. One of the things is to make sure that we're using informational text now. Now, I know that Dr. Austin and I see plenty of informational texts when we go in for shared reading, sometimes for independent reading, but let's consider, and this is kind of a challenge for all of us, the complexity of that. Think about, I know that you get some magazines that you often have the students read. What are they called?
Time for Kids.
National Geographic, Time for Kids. Take a minute before you assign that next time. Maybe use one of these rubrics and see, is it really that complex? Because we're moving towards the second half of the school year now. is that really the appropriate informational piece to be using at this point in the year? So not just more of the informational text, but beginning to take the knowledge of what we're talking about today and considering that a little bit more carefully. I know that Joanna was just saying a few minutes ago, well, gee, the very end of our DRA, the benchmark, is very simplistic. You know, she wants to stretch her students beyond that right now. So here's an opportunity to go in the book room and look for some of these that are more complex. So a challenge to you. The other thing too, Vicki, I want you to talk a little bit about how we're going to bridge that gap and that 20% mark. I know that you did the math, and she's one of these really analytical people, so this is kind of her aha moment.
I was really looking at that thinking, if I were in the classroom right now, how do I make this happen? So when I just looked at the 90-minute block, 28% is really 18 to 20 minutes. If we know that in a complex text we have to be doing a lot of scaffolding and we have to be doing the instruction at that point, and that the kids at these more complex levels for them are not ready to read it on their own, in my mind I just made the connection that this is a perfect opportunity during your guided reading groups. That 20 minutes, they're 20 minutes long, it's 20% of your block, and that would be an opportunity for you to really work with the kinds of scaffolding that kids need and choosing more complex text at that point. So that's just one way that I tried to make sense of what that could look like in a classroom.
So that really concludes kind of our slide presentation today. However, you know, the most important thing is we are learning together. We're going to be scaffolding our own information and knowledge as we move forward. And we're going to have lots of questions. We're going to have lots of comments. And I really appreciate the fact that people asked a lot of questions today. You have a lot of thoughts about things, and that's wonderful. What we're going to do right now is I'm going to ask Vicki and Pam to bring the informational text kind of to the table. As of course, you sat pretty much with your peers at your grade level to begin to look at some of the books that are the anchor sets or anchor books at your grade level. So we'll spend a little bit of time just having you look at some of those. You might even want to pull out your rubrics and kind of say, ooh, I wonder how it got to be in this band level. And we'll come back together in about 10 to 15 minutes.